Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Colleen Connell. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Illinois, and I want to welcome you to the ACLU's Mayoral Forum. We are really delighted that everyone is here, and we're particularly delighted that the candidates are here. We know everybody's had a very busy schedule and has done lots of these forums, and we feel very fortunate that you're here to talk about the many, many civil liberties issues that are important for the city of Chicago and that will be current, I think, in this election and in the next 4 years. I also want to thank Kent Law School for actually providing this wonderful space. The staff has been terrific to work with, and at that point I want to ask Dean Krent to come up so that I can thank him personally and let him say a few words of welcome. But again, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to a robust discussion.
Thanks, Colleen. On behalf of Chicago Kent, I want to thank the candidates for coming out here, the ACLU for organizing the event, but I also want to thank you all for coming on a very potentially blizzard night to be engaged, to care about this important election in Chicago's. And I've been a little encouraged the last couple of months that how there is more civic engagement going on. More people are applying to law school as a footnote. That's good for us. But in addition, our students came to us and said, we want election day off, as one example, because we want to go and become poll watchers. We want to get involved. And we did that. And I think that's a sign of good things to come. I now have the privilege of introducing the moderator tonight, Amanda Vinicky, who's the ace political correspondent of WTTW and Chicago Tonight. Amanda.
And y'all, why don't you just stay right on clapping, because I would like to echo your remarks. I am so impressed that you are all here tonight giving this big of a darn to spend not only a weekend night, but also this potentially snowmageddon, whatever it's going to be, together learning about civil liberties issues, your stance on them, and on the candidates before you cast your ballot. So give yourselves a big round of applause. And especially, let the people, there's evidently literally overflow rooms, I'm told. So cheers to you guys, wherever you are. We will get things started. I wanted to first lay out a bit of the parameters for the discussion, and in terms of why it is that you do not see every candidate who you will see on the ballot on the stage this evening. The ACLU did invite every candidate who filed petitions to participate in tonight's forum, but with two contingencies. And one is that they successfully made it through the petition challenge process. And the second was that the candidates submitted answers to the questionnaire given them by the ACLU of Illinois by the January 7th deadline. So those are the candidates who were who we have on stage. Are most of those who fit within those two parameters. However, Gary Chico did submit answers, but had made known a while ago that he was unable to attend this evening. Likewise, Gary McCarthy did answer that questionnaire, and you can find, by the way, all of the answers to the questionnaires on the ACLU website, but this afternoon said that he had childcare issues. Susana Mendoza is under the weather, and I do not mean the snow. And finally, Dorothy Brown, who likewise did submit answers to the questionnaire, but she actually is going through that petition challenge process literally as we speak. So there is that. Other candidates are not on stage because they never turned in those questionnaires, and that is Bill Daley, Bob Fioretti, Jeremiah Joyce, Neil Salas Griffin, and Willie Wilson. Without further ado, that does leave us with, however, a field of 6 who will be answering questions tonight. Amara Enyia, LaShawn Ford, John Kozler, Lori Lightfoot, Toni Preckwinkle, and Paul Vallas. So again, round of applause for each of them, please. Each of the candidates will get 90 seconds to give their opening introduction to themselves, and then also each will have 90 seconds allotted to respond to the questions that are posed to them. This is a forum, it is not a debate, so we ask that all of the candidates stay quiet and respectful as the other individuals give their responses to the questions. There is, however, no name used in debate rule, that if somebody brings up your name, it does not mean that you immediately get to pipe up and get a direct response to that. However, your 90 seconds are yours to use as you wish. I will do my best to prod you along to actually answer the question, but beyond that, you are welcome to, within that minute and a half, respond to something that another candidate said previously. These are questions that, per the program that was, or per the promises made by the ACLU, are based off of that questionnaire that you responded to. So many should be familiar, at least in terms of the ground that they cover. And I believe with that, those are the rules. I do want you to all pay attention to this fine lady, Chelsea Diaz, in the front row, will be the timekeeper. Yellow means that you have 30 seconds left, and red, means to stop. And so with that, we will get things going, and I'm going to take a seat and plug your ears for a second while I get this in here. Yeah, there's that nasty noise. Okay. And the first question, each of the questions, by the way, we will rotate, and apologies in advance if I am too busy listening to your responses and I mess that up, but we will go on the line and try and switch who goes first for each of the questions. And given that we are seated in alphabetical order, we will begin with that way. So you'll begin, Ms. Enyia. And the first question is in regards to reproductive rights and access to health care. And that is, what, if any, guardrails would you put in place for TIF funding? And should there be any sort of restrictions?
Opening statements?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, opening statements. This is why she is, all right, embarrassing already. Let's go for it. You'll start. Amara Enyia, opening statement.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank the ACLU of Illinois, as well as all of you for joining us on this evening. It is a pleasure to sit here before you as a candidate for mayor of Chicago. By profession, I work in public policy as a consultant. I've consulted with government entities, elected officials, but most importantly, community-based organizations and grassroots organizations that are pushing for change in their communities. I've worked at the top levels of government. I've also worked as an executive in the nonprofit sector. But the work that informs what I do every day is what I spent my time doing in communities, and that is making sure to amplify their voices so that we can push for the kind of city that we deserve. We are at a unique moment in Chicago where we probably have the best chance ever to really move the city in the right direction under new leadership that has a vision of what this city can be. But it requires us to have a different vision of the qualities of the leadership that we deserve. Issues of equity, of justice, of transparency. Those are the things that have been the hallmark of my career. And I am hopeful that in this election we will lift up the issues that we care about, and that we will be able to identify leadership that can move us into the future and break away from the past that has characterized so much of our lives in Chicago. Thank you.
And go ahead, Representative Ford.
Thank you, Amanda, and good evening. I have to say that today is a special day, and it's a very hard day with the verdict, however we expected it to turn out. And there's no better place to be than at an ACLU event to talk about justice. And I consider the ACLU a friend and a guiding light for me as a member of the General Assembly. I think my voting record speaks for itself on justice issues and voting issues as it relates to the advocacy from the ACLU and all of you in this room. So I thank you for your work in fighting for justice. I thank you for your work, and I'm very happy to see a lot of white people in the room that like to fight for justice, because us black people need your help to get justice in America, to get justice in the city of Chicago, to end racism, to end discrimination. it is costing us too much, and it's costing all of our families hardship. So thank you all for being here.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Kozler. The last time I was in this room, I was studying for the bar exam, so it brings back some bad memories. But first of all, I just want to thank everybody for being here today. It is a very, very important election. As you know, it's going to be probably a snowstorm later on tonight, so I do appreciate everybody for taking the time out of your nights for joining us here. And I also thank you to Chicago Kent and for the ACLU. The reason why I'm running for mayor of Chicago is because we have a tendency in this city of electing the same people over and over, yet we still face the same problems that we are facing in the year 2019 that we faced in the year 1980. And I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of those topics today, but I'm sure they're going to revolve around crime, education, and city finances. And we can go along in the year 2019 and continue that for the next 4 years, or we can elect somebody with a fresh approach, who's young and who's dynamic, but who's somebody who's going to listen to the community members. And we have a problem in government where once we get elected, we stand on a pedestal and look down upon the communities. And that needs a change. And we can do that in 2019, and that's why I'm running for mayor of Chicago. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lori Lightfoot. I want to use my opening comments not to talk about myself, but to talk about the moment that we're in. It's a heavy moment to be here with all of you in the aftermath of the acquittal yesterday and the sentencing today. Sentencing Jason Van Dyke to the equivalent of a home invasion for the murder of a young black man should give none of us any pleasure and should make ourselves question what justice looks like in Cook County. All of us can talk a lot about reform, we can talk about the vision that we want for the city, but fundamentally, if the murder of a young black man doesn't warrant real justice, then I don't know where we are as a city. And I think it underscores, particularly the events of the last 48 hours, 24 hours, that our judiciary has to have the same spotlight shined on it as other parts of the criminal justice infrastructure. I'll have more to say in the coming days, but I can tell you that I'm deeply disappointed by this sentence. I think it does not send a message of justice and equity as it should. The judge spent a lot of time talking about a lot of legal finer points, but when it came to this 81 months, he said virtually nothing to justify it, to give people a sense of his rationale, to provide legitimacy for the sentence. And I think that probably, in some ways, is the greatest injustice. So I felt like it was important for us to talk about this now. Thank you.
Good evening. This is a very difficult moment. I agree with Lori Lightfoot. You know, I've spent my entire public life motivated by social justice, and for those of us who believe in social justice, this has been a very hard week in Chicago. I'm president of the county board. We have two basic responsibilities, public health and public safety. I work to bring Obamacare to Cook County, and we now have 330,000 people who have health care who didn't have it before or only had it sporadically. We've worked for criminal justice reform and reduced reliance on bail bond, cash bond. As a result, we have 4,000 fewer people in the jail accused of nonviolent crimes. I've also worked hard to try to connect those who are unemployed and underemployed with opportunities in industrial sectors where they can find work. And I supported in Cook County raising the minimum wage and providing sick pay for individuals. I'm a founder of the Progressive Caucus. I've supported every affordable housing and living wage ordinance that came before the council when I was there. I worked with community residents to revitalize neighborhoods and to strengthen our public schools and address public safety issues. As a teacher, as a mother, as a grandmother, I know we need to strengthen our neighborhood schools. We need to bring jobs to our communities, and we need to address the public safety issues that challenge so many of our communities.
Well, thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. You know, the ACLU has never been more important an organization that it is today in the era of Trump and the civil liberty horror show that we're experiencing with children in cages and families being separated and all sorts of atrocities that we couldn't have imagined in this country. So I want to congratulate you, and I want to tell you I look forward to working with you. I'm a lifelong public servant. There are 6 veterans in my household. There are 4 police officers. There are 3 teachers. There's 1 firefighter. At the end of the day, all my life has been about public service. I got my start working for Dawn Clark-Netsch for 12 years, and she taught me more about public services and about accountability and about transparency than anyone who I've ever known. And my whole career has been responding to crises, whether it was transforming the Chicago public schools or going to Philly to rescue those schools when they were in financial crisis, or rebuilding New Orleans after Katrina, or going to Haiti, where I've been 50 times, in Chile after the earthquakes, even spending time in the Sudan, or working for over a year in the Justice Department for Sally Yates to reform education, occupational training in the prison system. I'm running because the city's in serious financial crisis, and because I have the skills to transform transform budgets into long-term financial plans that can make the investments in the community that are needed to be transformational so their city can begin to grow again. But I want to thank you for inviting me today. I look forward to a good discussion with my colleagues, and again, keep on doing what you're doing.
Thank you for each of that, and my apologies for trying to skip your intros in the first place. We will then, therefore, move on down the line, and I'm going to switch up the first question, and some of you got to this, but really it's what I'm sure most of the people in this room want to know, given that just this evening we did, after a long day in court, learn the sentence of former Chicago police officer Van Dyke, that he has been sentenced to 6 years and 9 months, so his time in prison is apt to be less should he get any good behavior. Starting with you, Representative Ford, is this sentence justified? Why and why not? If your answer is no, is there anything that you would propose being done to change the system?
Yeah, so I would say that on the...
And also, I'm sorry, before we restart the time, could I remind everyone to please speak very directly into the microphone, given that there are media organizations and this is live streaming, and we want to be sure that everybody's responses are picked up. Thank you.
Is there anything that can be done about the feedback?
Yeah, I believe they are working on that, yes. Sorry, and now you may re-begin.
Thank you, Amanda. I needed that reset. So I would say that, one, we have to remember that we are right now embarking on Dr. King's holiday, and I have to send a message as a candidate for mayor to the people of the city of Chicago that we know what happened with a tragedy of Dr. King and what happened in Chicago. Our streets and our neighborhoods are still suffering from the impact of that. So I think that we have to make sure that the community knows that it's time for us to come together and make sure that if we're not satisfied with this verdict, that we change laws, that we come together to do everything that we can, just like ACLU, join ACLU, join the NAACP, so that we can make the laws work for us. And the answer to the question, is it fair, is it just? I think we have to look at the record and see if there were any black people or any other people that may have been convicted of a more serious time frame for a similar crime. And I'll let the record and the history speak for me.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Kozler.
Yeah, it is a tough situation because, I mean, think about it. You have a young, dead kid, right? And we also have a family that's hurting from the police officer side, too. And nobody wins here. Nobody wins. And it's a tough subject for any of us to talk about. But I do agree we have to respect the law and the courts. But at the same time, we can't forget what happened here and that changes need to be made inside of City Hall. I mean, we can give sound bites to the media on how we disagree or agree, but if we don't work together and make specific changes, then we could potentially run into the same situation very shortly. And that's why I'm running for mayor of Chicago, because I have specific ideas that will make changes in moving forward. And we need to work on those. We do. We are up here as candidates, but again, this is our city. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I've worked for 8 years with children and took 550 of them off of the streets. And these are kids. They are our future, and if we don't invest in them, both from a policing standpoint and from a community standpoint, then we can run into these same issues. Thank you.
Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, I think you can glean from my opening comments that I don't think that the sentence was justified. Again, what's disappointing is that Judge Vaughn did not give any factual basis to explain the 81 months. I think it would be a less of a bitter pill to swallow had he taken time to do that. He talked about the fact that in the lead up to announcing his sentence that this was a case that was going to resonate nationally, and absolutely it will, but all the more reason why I think he owed an explanation to us as the public and certainly to LaQuan McDonald's family of why he arrived at the sentence that he did, and we didn't get that. And I say this as a lawyer, as someone who deeply and fiercely respects the rule of law, particularly, frankly, in the time of Trump. Sorry about that. But I think that he had to have understood the implications for his ruling on the city. And I think he left us with a lot of questions and a lot of doubt. And so that's why I feel both sad and frustrated with the sentence. And again, to sentence someone to 6 years and less than that with time off for good time, the equivalent of essentially a home invasion for a murder, it's hard, it's a bitter, bitter pill to swallow.
President Preckwinkle.
You know, I want to begin by commending the courage of the LaQuan McDonald family in pursuing justice for LaQuan, and the persistence and commitment of the community activists who kept this issue alive. I remember on the day after Thanksgiving in 2015, you know, the chants were 16 shots, 400 days in a cover-up. I'm grateful to those community activists who marched in the streets, who pursued justice through the courts, who got the videotape released, which showed quite clearly that the police narrative was entirely fabrication. LaQuan McDonald did not lunge at the officers. He was no threat to them. I will tell you that I was encouraged by the conviction of Jason Van Dyke. After all, he's the first police officer in 50 years convicted of murdering one of our residents. And there's no one in this room who believes that he's the only officer in 50 years who's murdered one of our residents. So I was grateful for his conviction. I'm profoundly disappointed by the acquittal this week of 3 officers who supported the false narrative that LaQuan McDonald lunged at Jason Van Dyke, who supported the lies, who covered up. And I'm profoundly disappointed and outraged by the verdict. You know, we have 2 standards of justice, one for black and brown people and one for police officers. You know, Paul and I were talking earlier, we both know Rod Blagojevich. He got 14 years. He got 14 years. He didn't even take any money. He got 14 years, not to mention the black and brown young people with drug offenses who get more than 81 months. It's disgraceful.
And Mr. Vallas.
I was surprised. I was surprised at the verdict. I was disappointed at the verdict. I believe he should have served longer. I made the comment, I said, look, 10 years ago, I think last month, Rod Blagojevich got indicted, and if you all remember, I ran against the organization, The Machine, and against Rod Blagojevich. So I was quite frankly surprised. And this is a father of 2 police officers and the husband of a police officer speaking on this issue. But I will tell you, the night LaQuan McDonald was shot, the police were calling for a taser because they had 500 tasers in the Chicago Police Department and they had 15,000 tasers in New York. And they were looking for direction from a sergeant, but they had 1 sergeant for every 30 officers and 1 sergeant for where the ratios are supposed to be 1 to 10. And you had a police department that was dealing with individuals who had been released or did not have mental health services because the mayor had closed the mental health centers with no training on how to deal and how to interact with those individuals. I mean, you know, the higher-ups never are held accountable. They are never held accountable. I felt Van Dyke was guilty, and I felt he should have gone to jail for a longer sentence. But at the end of the day, ultimately, What you saw was a failure of leadership, and that failure of leadership began in the mayor's office. And that's why I focused on laying out a strategy for dealing with the issues that need to be addressed to not only bring greater resources to the police department, but to build an infrastructure of accountability.
And we'll
Thank
have
you.
to cut you off there. And now to Ms. Enyia.
Okay.
On Black Friday in 2015, there were thousands of people on Michigan Avenue. And it was interesting to me because it was one of the few times where there were multiple generations represented, multiple factions, different organizations, sometimes who are at odds, came together because a young black teenager was killed by police. And at that point in time, it didn't matter what your political leanings were. It didn't matter who was running for mayor or who was running for office. All that mattered was that there was a young black child who was failed at every level, not just by the police department, but by our educational system, by the social service safety net that did not catch him, and then by elected officials for which he was merely a political inconvenience in an election. On October 5th, 2018, I stood with the organizers who went to meeting after meeting, sit-ins, marches, protests, die-ins, drafted legislation, and waited with bated breath to see if some justice would be served for Laquan McDonald. And we collectively exhaled. Yesterday, I stood with those same organizers who felt that we took 2 steps back. It's not just the fact that there are young black men in jail for weed longer.
I'm sorry, we'll have to cut you off there, given a time restriction. We're going to be sprinkling some yes and no questions throughout this forum. So this is merely, we will have you raise your hand for a yes, but also if you could speak it into the mic so that anybody who is listening and not able to see has some sort of indication. Or I will go down the line, in fact, I suppose, to make that clear. And that is, so I will go down the line. That would make more sense for those that are watching. Do you believe that a code of silence exists within the Chicago Police Department? Yes or no, Mr. Kozler?
No.
Yes.
Ms. Lightfoot?
Yes.
Preckwinkle, please?
Yes.
No.
Vallas? And say that again, please.
No.
Enyia?
Yes.
Ford?
Yes.
Thank you. We're going to stick with the CPD area for a bit here, and that is in regards to those who are calling for or examining the culture within the Chicago Police Department. What specific things should be done to shift the culture of the Chicago Police Department, if anything? And if you were mayor, how would you effectuate that change? And this question first goes to Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, there's lots of things that need to be done, and I've outlined many of them in our public safety plan, but let me give you a few highlights. Look, first, we have to create a culture of accountability and integrity within the police department. You do that by having, making sure that officers who are engaged in intentional misconduct are held accountable. Like what we did at the police board. When I got involved in the police board, only 35% of officers who came before the police board were held accountable. I changed that number over the course of my tenure to 73%. You've got to have an early warning system so supervisors have the opportunity not only to understand when an officer is going the wrong way, but a set of specific interventions to get that officer back on track, or if not, to manage them out of the department. You've got to have hold supervisors accountable. The culture of the department rests at the sergeant level. We do a miserable job of choosing sergeants. We do a miserable job of training them and holding them accountable. We've got to change that. But also fundamentally, we've got to enforce what's called Rule 14, which is the lie you die rule. There is no place for officers who lie on the job. And we saw that yesterday. That's why that acquittal is so disappointing. But officers have to have integrity. If they don't, they cast a pall on all the officers who are doing the job the right way, and they undermine any legitimacy that they have in the community. Those are the things that we need to do for starters.
Ms. Preckwinkle.
While we have to acknowledge that the police department is challenged in many respects, I think we also have to acknowledge that we've done them a disservice by not sufficiently investing either in proper training or proper supervision. You know, one of the things the Department of Justice report points out is that we have very little training, I think 2 days a year, something like that. And we have to have more training, particularly around crisis intervention and around de-escalation strategies. We need to have our police better prepared to come into difficult, especially domestic situations. We need to be sure that our police officers are well supervised. You know, the national average, the best practice is 8 to 10 officers for one sergeant. In some of our districts, we have 30 officers for one sergeant. So while our sergeants need to be better trained, they also have to have a manageable pool of folks that they're supervising. Our police force has to be more effective. You know, the national average for closure on murder rates for murders is 62, 63%. In Chicago, it's less than 20. It's less than 20%, and for shootings, it's less than 10. So we have some real challenges around effectiveness. We need to invest more in community policing. We need an Office of Criminal Justice in the mayor's office that focuses on bringing the stakeholders together to address the challenges in public safety, to support community organizations with violence prevention, anti-recidivism, and restorative justice grants, and will be the locus of policy. So there's a multi-layered challenge that we face to make our police force more effective. And as I said, while we're disappointed with things like the Code of Silence, we also have to understand
And with that, I'm
we
sorry, I'll
haven't
have to cut
properly
you off.
supported our police.
And Mr. Vallas.
Look, what we have to do is we have to rebuild the police department, both in terms of staffing and in terms of infrastructure. We've got to fill our vacancies because we were 2,000 police officers short so that we can have beat integrity, so the community is familiar with the police and the police are familiar with the community. Can't have community policing without beat integrity. Secondly, we've got to restore the detectives' ranks, and when you have a 17% clearance rates on murders, what you have to do is what other cities have done. You bring detectives out of retirement who are known to the community and who the community knows and trusts, and you bring them in and you have them work these cases. And you have to have a witness protection program because sometimes it takes 4 to 5 years for these cases to get resolved and the victims go back to the community. Third is you have got to have an infrastructure of command and control. You've got to have the right sergeant ratios to officers. You've got to have training officers that are monitoring these officers. If you don't have command and control, you don't have accountability. Fourth, you need redundant training. Redundant training, that means continual training. So that these officers are trained again and again and again and again. Fifth, you've got to reopen, you've got to put a mental health and wellness center in every district so that they can work with the police department and they can work with the schools. And finally, you've got to ensure that the next generation of police officers come from the community. There are 10,000 students in RLTC programs here in Chicago Public Schools. 90% are Black and Latino. What if they became the next generation of first responders? That would have a transformational effect.
Thank you. Ms. Enyia.
I think first and foremost, building legitimacy of the police department requires a commitment to actually implementing the reforms as stated in the consent decree, but also as put forth by community organizations that have been working on this issue for years. We have demonstrated that we do not have the commitment yet, which is why we're paying $1.7 billion for police misconduct cases. Secondly, recognizing that police officers, as in any profession, have to be continually trained. As lawyers, for example, we have to do CLE courses to make sure that you are up to speed on the latest legal theories. As doctors, you have to be continually trained to make sure that you're up to speed on the latest medical practices so that you can be at the forefront of your profession. The police department is no different. It's not sufficient to train them once or to train them every so often. They have to be trained continuously. That training also has to be expanded. We've talked about de-escalation. We've also talked about having to deal with individuals who have mental health issues, but also expanding those services so that we have additional staff that are properly equipped to manage those mental health issues. I think there are a number of things that we have to do, but even if we go to the criminal justice system and looking at judges, it's also an issue of the records of judges that are presiding over these cases. We can't leave that out of the equation. That goes to whether or not justice is served in any cases that involve police misconduct.
Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Amanda. I would say that it all starts at home, and it starts in our schools, and that's why I introduced legislation to make sure that the students in our Chicago public schools have to learn African American history. We have to know each other. We have to know each other's struggles, and when we do that, it makes it better for you in your profession. So we have to make sure that police have a rigorous training as well. We also have to make sure that they learn critical race theory. It's critical for us to get rid of racism and discrimination in our police department. It's costing us too much. Secondly, we have to increase technology to help with the solving of murders. That the number one way to improve policing is to build trust with the community and solve murders. That deters crime. And finally, I would say that we have a person here named Tyrone Muhammad that I took in to meet with Superintendent Eddie Johnson, because he has a program and he's been working to try to save black and brown kids' lives by de-escalation. And so we have to make sure that the police department works hand in hand with the community and community organizations so that we can deal with the problems. The city of Chicago is responsible for the education, and they're responsible for the policing. The question is, which will they prefer to invest the most in?
So the problem that we face is that there's too much tension between the communities and the police department. And my specific plan as your mayor will be, in order to police in that district, 60% of the police officers have to live in that district. So now they're not seen as outsiders, they're seen as community members, because they'll be investing in the neighborhood, they'll know their neighbors, and they'll know the streets. Now you're reducing the tension because the community members will be more willing to cooperate with the police department. The other thing is we do need more training. There are bad apples out there in the police department. I personally feel that the vast majority of them are good people. But if we're going to hold our officers accountable, we should also hold our elected officials accountable. This whole mishap started from the top, ladies and gentlemen. Rahm Emanuel was the one who held this video. He should be held accountable. And he kept it quiet because it was election year. And Toni Preckwinkle, I know her heart's in the right place, but she's the one that supported Rahm Emanuel even after he covered up the video.
I didn't support him.
So he too should be held accountable, and so should Toni Preckwinkle. She didn't jump into this race until after Rahm Emanuel dropped out. I was in this race from day one, and if you are afraid to stand up against Rahm Emanuel, you should not be in this race because you're afraid to stand up for the citizens of Chicago.
And with that, am I correct that our next question first goes to President Preckwinkle? Am I correct in that tally? Okay. Sort of sticking along the lines, what policies would you implement regarding the use of surveillance technology that is used by the city, including by law enforcement as well as city contractors?
Okay, let me begin by talking about my relationship with Rahm Emanuel. I think it's worthwhile pointing out. I'm going to step back while you do that. Yes. I think it's worthwhile pointing out that I've been very critical of him when he disparaged teachers. I pointed out that I was a teacher for 10 years. I never knew any teachers who were in it just for the money, as he implied. I criticized the closing of schools. I released the autopsy report to the family and to the activists so they could pursue their efforts to get the videotape released. We have worked together, but that's about all I can say about it. So I think that needs to be clear at the very beginning. You know, I've worked hard in my public life, as I said, committed to social justice. And I think that that's a mission that I take really seriously. And one of the challenges we have in the city of Chicago is that there's not a commitment to social justice and equity in the way in which we do our business, whether it's investments in communities, in infrastructure, whether it's investment in our public schools, whether it's investment in our neighborhoods and particularly employment opportunities. And so the challenge that we have is to try to be sure that our resources are equitably allocated, and that's not what I see in Chicago at the moment.
Mr. Vallas.
Let me take the liberty and mention something too. You know, I've run major institutions, and whenever I've gone into those institutions, there's been the mythology of those institutions. Chicago Public Schools, the most corrupt schools in the country. You know, teachers' unions, unreasonable, unwilling to work and cooperate. New Orleans, a horrid district who would have to completely clean house in terms of administrators. Every single district I've taken over, but yet every single district I've gone into, I've discovered just the opposite. When we talk about codes of silence begin at the top. They begin at the top. You have people in leadership positions. We've had a code of silence on burials. We've had a code of silence on Burke and corruption in the city council. We've had a code of silence at the top of the police department who have been covering up this and other things. I mean, it begins with the top. It begins at the top. You set the tone. You set the tone. The leader sets the tone. So, you know, we can talk about codes of silence. One can argue that every organization has a code of silence, but it begins at the top with leadership. Leadership can change that, and they can change that on a dime. Now, in terms of technology, look, you know, technology is going to continue to evolve, but my approach has been to work with the organizations and the advocates like the ACLU and others to really, you know, create a mechanism so that we can have a discussion about technology, not only the standard technology we're dealing with, but the facial technologies that are coming. Because at the end of the day, we can use technology to our advantage, but we've got to make sure that we're doing it responsibly.
Ms. Enyia.
There are specific concerns when it comes to monitoring and surveillance technology, particularly how it's used on average residents. One is the standardization of use and how that data is being collected and stored. So we have to have clearly outlined parameters on how and where that data is stored so that it does not compromise sensitive information for residents. And as someone who has recently had my data compromised, this is of personal significance to me. Second is how that information can be utilized. In many of the police misconduct cases, there were questions around what is the proper time to release, for example, the Laquan McDonald video? Is it 60 days after it was obtained? Is it 30 days? Are we adhering to those standards? Those parameters also have to be very strictly adhered to so that there's consistency in how this data is being used. Third, you have technology that is used, for example, to maintain a gang database in Chicago where no one is clear how they got on the gang database and no one knows how they can get off. What is the purpose of it, and is it tied to a specific use? I would argue that it is not and is a violation of people's rights. So this is an example of when it goes too far. Technology can be used in a supportive way, but without clear parameters on how it is used, when it is released, and transparency so that the public has access to how this technology operates and how it's used, it will be used, I think it's likely to be used in a detrimental fashion.
Mr. Ford.
I thought I answered the question.
No.
I'll speak again. What was the question?
I'm like, I don't think so. And that is in regards to what policies would you implement regarding the use of surveillance technology by the city? I don't think, didn't think so. So that does include by law enforcement as well as city contractors, so red light cameras, what have you.
Yeah, it's important to know that the technology has impacted African Americans and other minorities more. So we do have to make sure that we look at the way technology is used. I know one of the candidates in the race is not on the panel, but he wants drones in the communities, and that's just ridiculous, and that's daily. So technology is not at all, shouldn't work against the community. It should work in favor of making sure that we have it works in our, they distracted me. Was that by design? Now, Madam President, you are a teacher. Okay, all right. Well, then you could talk some more. So I think I agree with what the panel has said, and I was a little distracted because, as I said, I'm thinking about today.
Mr. Kozler.
Yeah, I mean, with technology, I mean, when you're talking about to make ourselves safe, so the red light cameras, although they were implemented for the right reasons to keep us safe, they were not practiced in the right method. So they had the yellow light was delayed, and the only areas that there should be red light cameras are to protect our children in front of school zones. It should not be used as to tax us all more and more. As far as technology goes, I mean, we see a lot of implementation within the CTA. I think certain cameras in certain areas can benefit us all as far as catching criminals, because there are some bad people in Chicago, and we need to protect our citizens. But, you know, I'm going to reiterate, and I know Paul brought this up too, it does start at the top. And he named a few individuals. Burke, Barrios, and Rahm. And there's one person on the stage who supported all three. And it's not me. And again, we have to hold our elected politicians accountable and call them out when they try to fool us every election. And that's why we have to stop electing the same people. They're all a part of the same network, which is their code of silence, where they only take care of their families and friends and put Chicagoans second. And that needs to stop. And I know under my administration that's going to stop because I grew up in the neighborhoods. I've taken care of children. And it's about time that Chicago turns beautiful with our politicians. Thank you.
Move on. The first one to answer this question is Mr. Vallas.
Wait,
and
I didn't get to answer the question.
Sorry. Please go ahead. I'm sorry. Ms. Lightfoot with an answer to the
So
surveillance
the question's about surveillance. and
Correct. It
since
is
I'm
about
a Girl Scout, I'm
surveillance.
going to actually answer that question.
All right, good.
Look, the problem that we have with technology is that it advances at such a rapid pace, and particularly when we're talking about law enforcement, there's a tendency to go to the next shiny object and implement it without thinking about the repercussions. So what we need to do, obviously technology is important. We looked at, for example, the bombing in London, where they were able to use the cameras to quickly identify the people who were the perpetrators of the crime, or frankly the poisoning in London, again using CCTV to identify people. And the flip side of that is this summer when we had 70 shootings, 12 people murdered, we only have one arrest, even though those incidents happened outside, even though they were advertised on Facebook, because the technology frankly wasn't used to keep people safe. So what we need to do when we think about technology, and particularly when it comes to law enforcement, is we have to have protocols in place before the technology is rolled out, working with stakeholders like the ACLU, working with and following, I think, the very good guidance of our Inspector General, who's spoken very eloquently about these issues, to really think about the upsides and the downsides of the use of technology. Technology is going to be there. We're going to use it. But we have to use it in a way that doesn't trample on people's civil rights. There's obviously a way that we can do that, but we have to have smart leadership in place before the technology is rolled out and used on or against the public.
Apologies again for my having skipped you, but this time for real. The first question goes to Mr. Vallas, and that is, does Chicago need to review how individuals are added to its gang database? And should there be a moratorium while that review, should you believe there needs to be one, is in the works?
Well, yeah, we need a new database, period. I mean, the current gang database is wrong in so many ways, articulated time and again. I mean, you know, we need to have a database, but that database needs to be updated, it needs to be continuous, it needs to be purged appropriately. I mean, there are people on that database going back, I mean, they almost become like marked, permanently marked. So at the end of the day, I think there needs to be a new database, and we need to assess and evaluate the existing database, perhaps consider a moratorium, but clearly we need something, but we need something that is going to meet standards. We need something that's going to be purged of old data, and we need something that's going to be narrow enough so that we're getting at what needs to be done, and that is to provide police officers and other law enforcement officials with the information that they need to help them in their crime-fighting abilities, but at the end of the day, does not cross the line and does not violate their civil rights.
Thank you. Ms. Enyia.
The gang database is tied to the issue of profiling, and racial profiling in particular. Because that issue has not been addressed, this is what makes the gang database very problematic. When you have communities that are over-policed, anyone in those communities is liable to be profiled and put on the gang database. So we have to look at, first, how do you get on? Where is the clarity in terms of the criteria for an individual to be placed on the gang database? Is that available to the department, and is that information available to the public? It is not. Second, how long does one stay on the database? When they're 18 to 45 to 50? At what point can they get off the database? You don't know. So this is an issue of transparency. That criteria has to be public so that there's accountability when individuals who should not be in the database are in there. Two, are we actually addressing the racial profiling to make sure that communities, especially immigrant communities, black and brown communities, are not being placed on the database because they are simply over-policed? Three, how are we making sure that this database is updated? In my view, we shouldn't have it. I think it's problematic already, and people's lives are being destroyed as we speak. But if we're going to move forward with anything, we have to start with a baseline of transparency, accountability, clear criteria, and a way for people to understand how they got on and how they got off. And there has to be recourse for individuals who found themselves on that database when they didn't even have any idea that they were.
Thank you. Mr. Ford.
Absolutely, some things are just simple. Abolish it. I mean, we have a police department that is clearly untrained, racist, and they discriminate and they profile. We cannot allow for a police department that the DOJ says that they over-police black people. They over-police black and brown communities. So to give them the weapon of a gang database is absolutely absurd, and it should not be updated. It should be eliminated. Oh, I still got time. I do have a bill that I'm working with Senator Van Pelt in Springfield and ACLU to do exactly that, eliminate it.
Mr. Kozler.
So I believe that it should be updated, and the reason why I love you though. I love you. The reason why I feel that it should be updated is because if you are currently on there for a non-violent crime, you should be taken off. I believe in second chances, that if you were somebody who potentially were young and then you got older, that your mindset changed. So although your mindset at a young age might be different when you're older, at least you might have grown, right? So I don't think those individuals should be on that gang database for the rest of their lives. So updated in the sense of take people who have nonviolent crimes off of it and then give people a second chance. But who I do think that should stay on it are people who carry illegal guns. So if you carry an illegal weapon, I want to make sure that we prevent a future crime. We shouldn't wait until some 3-year-old gets shot or a 5th-year-old gets shot or anybody in our community gets shot. We shouldn't wait for that to happen if somebody has an illegal weapon. So those individuals should be staying on the gang database. The other part is that some of this information can be useful to our police officers once we update it. And I think the more we equip our police officers not only with training but with better technology, the more we can prevent crime. But I honestly do feel that in order for crime to be reduced in Chicago, we have to reduce the tension between our communities and police officers, and my 60-40 plan will do that.
Ms. Lightfoot.
I've been very clear that the gang database has to be decommissioned. And the truth is it's multiple databases, it's not one. We don't really know what the gating mechanism is for CPD to put somebody into the database. I know from my experience as a federal prosecutor, sometimes agents and police officers are a little overzealous in thinking that somebody is a quote-unquote bad guy, and then they get on the list. I think a lot of teachers in CPS would be alarmed to know that if they report somebody for a disciplinary problem, that in and of itself can be a basis for getting somebody into one of these databases. So it has no legitimacy. CPD, frankly, can't justify how it is that people get on a database, so it's got to be decommissioned. They have to be decommissioned in entirety. Now, obviously, there can be legitimate reasons for having a database, particularly in the context of counterterrorism. But as has been said by others, there's got to be clear protocol. There's got to be transparency. People have to know that they're on it, and they have to know how to petition to get off of it. That should be very, very clear. And until those criteria are in place, nothing's going to have any legitimacy, and we can't go forward with the current system as it is right now.
You know, it's quite clear that the gang database has to be eliminated. You have to understand there are 128,000 people on the gang database. 128,000 people. 11% of the African American community, 11% is in the gang database. And 4% of the Latinx community is in the database. And there are no criteria, there are no guidelines. You know, he was talking about nonviolent crimes. You don't have to commit a crime to be in the gang database. Somebody just has to put you in there. The police officer can put you in there for any arbitrary, capricious reason. You know, and you can't get off. They're dead people on the gang database. I mean, this is ridiculous. And 80-year-olds, thank you. You know, and furthermore, they share the information in the gang database with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and therefore they can use that information to deport people. And they share it with employers, and they share it with people who own apartments and want to check out people. You know, this is an unconstitutional infringement of our civil rights. There is no way that you can defend the gang database. Now, the police department has a much smaller, several thousand strategic subjects list of people they're concerned will be shooters, be victims, or perpetrators of violence. Now, it seems to me if you're going to focus on the violence that our communities face and the challenges we face, we would look at having a reasonable strategic subjects list and forget entirely, eliminate entirely the gang database. It's an infringement of our civil rights.
This is another yes or no question. So once again, I will go down the line, starting with you, Ms. Enyia. And that is, should the city, and would you ensure that every city agency and private city contractor has a policy that covers transition-related health care and also that prohibits discrimination against employees who are transgender? Yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Mr. Kozler?
Yes.
Ms.
Yes.
Lightfoot?
Yes.
Preckwinkle? Vallas?
Yeah, well, as someone who actually put domestic
Yes
partners
or no?
in all the
Wow,
city
we're not
contracts,
sure.
I would say
no,
yes.
No cheating, yes or no. All right. Nice try, though. I'm more of an essayist than a multiple choice myself. But now to Mr. Ford, along those lines, this is the question that I'd originally jumped to in skipping your introduction. So again, my apologies there. What, if any, guardrails would you put in place regarding the use of TIF money? Should TIF money be restricted to healthcare providers that should there be any restrictions on healthcare providers that provide information related to contraception, sterilization, and abortion care, as well as assisted reproductive health care, transition-related health care, and so on? So in essence, again, what guardrails, if any, would you put in place regarding TIF funding on healthcare providers, an issue that we've seen Chicago already have some debates with? Mr. Ford.
I would say that if the clinic, the facility will provide jobs and opportunities in the community where they're going to build, and if they're going to do a good for the community and live up to the law of what TIFs are supposed to do for the community, I would support it. The key for TIFs are, one, it's supposed to go in blighted areas. It's supposed to create jobs in those communities. And if the doctor's office or clinic that's trying to apply for a TIF could pass those tests, then they're okay with my administration.
Regardless of whether or not they provide reproductive services and again, healthcare for transition-related and transgender individuals.
And so with the help of the ACLU, as a Catholic that believes in social justice, I supported the reproductive rights bill to make sure that women are protected and that they have a right to have reproductive health care. So I support the issue. Did that answer the question directly?
Somewhat. Should TIF funding be restricted? Should there be no TIF funding granted if providers do not provide those services?
TIF money, if they provide the services and if they meet their criteria, they could receive TIF money to build or renovate facilities. Yes.
Mr. Kozler.
Right, so sometimes during elections we have all these issues, but if we don't get our city finances, if we don't get our education in line, if we don't get our crime in line, we're not going to have a city. And that's one of the things that I'm concentrating as mayor. And then you listen to outside groups, not only for the current issues, but for other issues dealing with reproductive rights and how we use our TIF funds. So, for instance, the TIF funds, when it comes to healthcare, I think they should be used for mental health, because there's a lot of people who are struggling on the streets of Chicago. When it comes to reproductive rights, I do have a sister, I do have a mother, but I was also raised Catholic. And so, I mean, to answer your question directly, and we'll probably get some booze here, but I am somebody who believes that I don't believe in abortion for late term. I do believe that women should make that decision early on, just so we don't have a 9-month child getting killed. That's my personal opinion. I know we're going to have people who differentiate. I called it. But I'm going to be honest with everyone. I'm not going to tell anybody what you want to hear. It's just how I feel. There's going to be people in another audience who might agree. So that's how I feel about your question.
And in the TIF question, real quick, yes or no? So TIF money, there would be no restrictions regarding.
So for instance, like mental health, I agree with, but certain the other, like abortion, I wouldn't agree with that.
Okay. No restrictions regarding whether or not they provide reproductive care. Understood. Ms. Lightfoot.
So I'm assuming this question arises from the horrible tragedy of providing TIF funding to President's Healthcare that discriminates against women's right to choose. We have to speak our values in every dollar that we spend, in every contract that we let. That, I think, is our obligation to taxpayers. And of course, we should never provide public funding to any entity that discriminates, period, full stop.
And can you bring that microphone a little closer, perhaps?
Me?
Yes, thank you.
You know, Cook County has two fundamental responsibilities, public health and public safety. Half of our money goes into health care. And we proudly provide comprehensive health care services to our residents, and that includes reproductive health care. Information about contraception, behavioral health services. We provide comprehensive services, and that's what every public health institution does, and that's what every private health institution should do as well. We shouldn't be denying the patients who come into these institutions comprehensive care, and that includes reproductive health care. So I would deny public resources, including TIF resources, to those hospitals and clinics that don't provide that comprehensive care, that deny that to the patients who come to them. I think this is a civil right. You should be able to go to your healthcare provider and expect that they will provide you with the comprehensive services that you need.
As someone who, and as I was, the point I was trying to make earlier when I tried to elaborate on my yes or no answer, as someone who actually put domestic partners in all of my city contracts and school district contracts before there were popular things to do, I'm talking about the 1990s, and supported same-sex marriages when I ran for governor. I've always been adamant against discrimination of any type, and I've always been adamant against the allocation of public funds to entities that would discriminate. But having worked in Haiti and having worked with a number of not-for-profits, particularly religious not-for-profits that have done really heroic work in most trying circumstances, I'm inclined to say that we should not allocate any money, any public funds, to organizations that would discriminate, and then allow ourselves to consider a case-by-case exception. It's as simple as that. But at the end of the day, I do not support the use of public funds or the allocation of public funds to entities that discriminate, period.
We have a lot of issues with TIF spending generally. So the idea that we are debating whether or not to provide TIF funds to an entity that would discriminate against a certain part of the population, quite frankly, is disappointing. We haven't addressed corruption. We haven't addressed the TIF funds that are given to organizations that don't adhere to the redevelopment agreements. So this issue, it was quite contentious last year in City Council when it came up. At the end of the day, the public dollars are used in service of the public. Once organizations are able to begin to parse out who they serve and who they do not serve, that is essentially a use of public funds that is used for a purpose other than the benefit of the general public. And we cannot go down that path. So I think it was important in the city to make a strong statement that we cannot give public dollars to any entity that would then use those dollars in a way that would discriminate against other members of the public. I think that is a strong stance that we have to take, because the alternative is that we will continue to misuse those dollars and allow the public to be brought into, quite frankly, circumstances that could open the door for legal liability down the line and compromises our values as a city.
Well, as a journalist, I have done many of these forums, and let me tell you that every candidate, every administration talks a lot about being the most transparent, ever. So I would like to know, how will the mayor's office under your administration implement policies regarding the public's right to information? Please do give specifics. This question is first posed to Mr. Kozler.
Yeah, I am a firm believer in transparency. So, for instance, if you are somebody in the community that has a FOIA request, that should be adhered to. Right now, we have a lot of inertia when it comes to city government providing information to our citizens, and that needs to stop. And I was fighting corruption before I was in the newspaper. So I ran against a daily 4 years ago in the 11th Ward as for alderman, and what they do, not just dailies, but the corrupt politicians, they tend to keep information away from the public, and they do that to keep themselves in office. And we saw, a couple weeks ago with the whole Burke scandal. And that's because they continue to help themselves and their friends. And it's not until they are forced to take action that they do, and it's usually when they get caught, and all of a sudden nobody knows who Burke is nowadays. But that's why we read the papers, and that's why we do our own research. We don't need to have an election year where we get fooled again. We can make honest decisions for ourselves. And we have to call a spade, and corruption. And there's 4 people in this race. Some of them are not on the stage right now, but somebody is. It's just corrupt politicians in Chicago, and we have a beautiful city overall. It's just we don't have a nice and equitable political environment, and we need to change that. And that comes down to this election.
Ms. Lightfoot.
I'm still stuck on a spade. But
Deck of cards.
Words matter. If you want to know what I think about transparency, please do look at our Good Government Plan, which we released back in August. And we talked about a number of things there, not allowing elected officials to monetize their positions, a la Burke, taking back a workers' compensation plan, a la Burke. But on the question of transparency, look, the city, particularly over the last 7 years, has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting transparency by virtue of the fact that they don't put enough information up on websites. People have to hire lawyers and file FOIA requests to get basic information about how city functions. That obviously has to stop. So in a Lightfoot administration, we're going to work to put as much information out in the public domain as possible. I'd love to get to a point where, frankly, people don't need to file FOIA requests because all of that information is out there and available. I want to make sure that not only I, but department heads are doing everything they can to be present in neighborhoods to provide people with information about how government functions, where they need to go to get services. But fundamentally, again, it is tone at the top. It starts with a leadership that's independent, that believes in equity and transparency and accountability in government.
Ms. Preckwinkle.
In my first term of office, I said that we were going to try to do 4 things. We were going to try to make government fiscally responsible. We were going to bring innovative leaders to the county. We were going to be transparent and accountable, and we were going to improve services. And we've put a lot of emphasis in the county on transparency and accountability. We've invested a lot of money in information technology. We make all of our contracts, and how far we are along in them, who our vendors are. We make data available about county properties. We make data available about county activities on our website. You can go to cookcountyil.gov and find out a tremendous amount of information about what we're doing in Cook County, because we made it a priority from the very beginning of my administration. And we invested in technology to be able to share information more fully and completely with our residents. And we've expanded exponentially the amount of information that people have available to them. So this is an example of the advantages of having been an elected official. You can actually point to the accomplishments that you've had over the last several decades. So, this is important, and we've done it.
Mr. Vallas.
Oh, great. Well, look, we've reached a point with technology where there's absolutely no reason why you can't have access to all the information you need, as long as that information does not violate certain confidentiality provisions regarding individuals' personal information. So making that information transparent online and accessible in real time, and making it understandable, or laying it out in a format so people can understand, rather than just send them 800-page unannotated budget, is something that can easily be done. Secondly, you have got to create, you've got to put civilian representation on any board that involves the allocation of public funds. So there needs to be civilian representation, not picked from the mayor, but picked from the organizations, the advocacy groups that it's about. So when I've talked to the disability community, or for that matter, when I've talked to the Humane Chicago community, or for that matter, when I've talked to other community-based organizations on economic development, I've talked about those organizations identifying individuals civilians who can be on those boards, because you don't get transparency without independent civilian oversight. So those are three basic things that the next mayor can do, and that the next mayor can mandate via executive order. It's not rocket science.
Ms. Enyia.
So I take a much broader approach to what transparency is. Transparency is not just putting PDFs online, as individuals who were involved, for example, in the TIF Illumination Project, learned early on. Sifting through thousands of pages of PDFs is not very helpful unless that's what you enjoy doing, and very few people enjoy doing that. So transparency is about making the information available, but also in a way that is easily digestible by the public. The city has to actually invest in educating the public on the information that they are seeing and reading. That is something that we can do to make sure that it's being received in a way that's beneficial to the general public. Transparency is also not just in the information that's shared, it's in the accessibility to that information. It includes when our meetings are held. So having school board meetings in the middle of the day when parents are not available, that's a transparency issue. Having budget meetings where you only have 1 or 2 budget meetings around the city, that's a transparency issue. There should be budget meetings happening across the city before budget season starts, so that people know what is being talked about when they're deliberating in city council. Meetings should be streamed online. We have technology. These should be available to the public when critical information is being discussed that will affect your day-to-day lives. These are other aspects of transparency that we have to talk about. It's not just putting information online, it's making it digestible, it's educating the public on how to use and hopefully take that information to advocate for themselves, and it's about granting more accessibility so that we can get access to that information.
Mr. Ford.
So one of the advantages of being in the race for mayor, you get to hear good ideas. I heard some good ones that my administration will consider implementing. But one thing that I have to say is we have to make sure the Inspector General is a friend to the public, and that the Inspector General is available for the public to make complaints and to make inquiries. Secondly, I think it's so important that hearings take place on everything that happens in City Hall. We know recently the mayor forced through some ordinances to raise taxes on businesses. He didn't need any public hearings, he was just able to do it. That is not right, and anything that goes through the city council that impacts taxpayers must have public hearings. And so with all the technology, I agreed with that we make sure that we have that ready and available, but making sure that we have access to hearings for everything that taxpayers have to pay for is critical.
Thank you very much. Let's do another yes/no question. So this will begin with Ms. Lightfoot, I believe, and that is, do you support ending the use of driver's license suspension as a penalty for non-moving violations such as unpaid parking or compliance tickets? Yes or no, Ms. Lightfoot?
Absolutely, and I've been very vocal
Ms.
about that.
Ms. Preckwinkle?
Yes, of course.
Mr. Vallas?
Yes.
And Ms. Enyia?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Mr. Kozler?
I kind of want to say no to get everybody's reaction. No, yes, 100%. 100%.
Okay, I'm all for livening up a debate. Okay. The next question will be posed first to President Preckwinkle. Would you remove the provision in city ordinance that allows Chicago police to assist ICE agents when an individual has a penalty, regardless of when that felony occurred?
You know, I think it's really important.
And
that-
speak into the mic there.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the last part of the question, please?
Yes, the provision in city ordinance allowing Chicago police to work with ICE agents when an individual has a felony, regardless of when that felony occurred.
One of the things I'm very proud of is in the course of my first term, working with then Commissioner Garcia, now Congressman Garcia, we strengthened our own welcoming county, sanctuary county ordinance to prohibit any cooperation with ICE by the county. And one of the things we prohibited was the previous activity of ICE, which was after a judge said that somebody could go free, we detained them in the jail until ICE checked to see if they were on any of their lists, and then took them out of the jail. And we said anybody who is allowed to go free by a judge, regardless of their citizenship status, should go free. And so we stopped all cooperation with ICE. And I'm very, very proud of that. You know, we should not expect local law enforcement officials to be doing the federal government's immigration enforcement. And frankly, I was asked by Jay Johnson, who was then the head of Homeland Security, to be more fully engaged with the Department of Homeland Security around immigration and customs enforcement, and we refused. I refused on behalf of the people of the county.
Mr. Vallas.
Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
Of course. Would you remove a provision in city ordinance allowing Chicago police to assist ICE agents when an individual under scrutiny has a felony, regardless of when that felony occurred?
You know, I really think it depends on the felony. Look, when I ran the Chicago Public Schools, we had sanctuary schools. In other words, we provided all the benefits, all the supports, regardless of what the children's immigrant status was, and we provided no access to information, period, et cetera, not only for the children, but for the families themselves. Look, you know, I'm as irritated at ICE and at the federal government's intrusion as anyone out here. But I want to make sure that we do cooperate when it involves cases of individuals who have been subjected to serious felony charges. And because at the end of the day, many of these individuals are preying on the immigrant communities that we want to protect and we want to support. So at the end of the day, you know, I think there should be strict rules, but I don't want to totally tie our hands to cooperate with the federal government when it is certainly most appropriate.
Ms. Enyia.
So I think so there's two issues. One is that whenever we talk about immigration, we talk about criminalization or the criminal justice system, which I find problematic because we automatically criminalize individuals based upon their immigration status. Two is we already have police officers in the city of Chicago who are here to deal with criminals. So if there is a criminal act or if an individual has committed a felony and has been apprehended or arrested, et cetera, there are already processes in place. So now it becomes an issue of resources, whether we will now use our resources to work in tandem with the federal government to identify criminals, which to me the only end to that process is whether or not that individual will be deported. So I think we have to focus our resources within the police department on the criminals that are here. There are already processes in place for that. I don't see the need to expend our resources to assist the federal government. They have resources and processes in place already. And I think also it's important for us to be able to have a conversation about immigration without always having to link it to criminality.
Mr. Ford.
Every time I hear the conversation about immigration, I think about all of the Americans and Chicagoans and Illinoisans that have felonies that this state, this city, and this country seem to take away their rights. And so I really believe strongly in fairness and justice for everyone. I voted for sanctuary state for the purposes of protecting people and protecting their liberties and protecting their rights as human beings. And so I would also support that in the city of Chicago. But it's important to know that under this administration, there's nothing we could support about ICE. We must stand against ICE under the Trump administration because we can't trust them. So the answer is absolutely.
Mr. Kozler.
I believe the first people we should deport are corrupt politicians. Second, I do support Chicago as a sanctuary city in the sense of I want to keep our good families here. I'm not a part of this crowd that just goes into families' homes and breaks that apart. I mean, but that's a federal situation we need to get resolved as far as immigration goes. The other part is I do not feel that city resources should be used to assist ICE. Like Amara said, we have a lot of crime in Chicago that we need to handle, and our resources all need to be designated to our city of Chicago. But as far as criminality, I mean, we don't want to recruit people who are criminals. I mean, we have enough criminals here. And if you are a known criminal and you are trying to hide out in Chicago, I think we should address that issue. But again, if you are here as a family member and you've done well and you're, as far as doing well, I mean, you have a family and you want to stay in Chicago, I think you should be allowed here. And that's why we are welcome to the city. My family came from Croatia and Italy. And, Chicago is an immigration city, and it should remain that.
Ms. Lightfoot.
The issue that we're talking about is not just a resource issue. It's a statement about what our values are. What we're talking about is on the mere signature of an ICE agent, a person's life can be completely and utterly upended. That's why we need to eliminate all the exceptions to the Welcoming City Ordinance, because this is a statement about our values. We cannot have a city in which a politicized ICE, used as a tool of a xenophobic, racist, horrible president, are terrorizing people in our community. We just can't tolerate that. And it relates, it's the same question as what we were talking about before regarding the gang database. We don't know why an ICE agent may sign a detainer for a particular individual. But we do know that if there's a federal judge that actually vets a warrant, that's a whole different issue. But that's not what the Welcoming City Ordinance talks about. It's the mere signature of an ICE agent, and we can't tolerate that in our city. And I have a little more time. I just want to correct one issue. The strategic subject list is just as problematic, if not more so, than the gang database. We need to get rid of that as well. The CPD doesn't own the data. They don't know what the variables are that go into putting somebody on a list. It's equally as problematic.
And this final question, after this, we will give 1 minute to each of the candidates for closing statements. So the final question is posed first to Mr. Vallas, and that is, presuming that a new contract has not been finalized by the time you were to become the mayor and enter the mayor's office, are there any changes you would demand in a new contract with the Fraternal Order of Police? If so, what would those changes be?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question.
Not meant to be. You can answer no.
Look, no, are there changes? Yes. The answer is yes. But, let me answer that question by talking about how I've negotiated contracts, because I've negotiated teacher contracts. I've negotiated contracts with police security in Philadelphia. With the police department, it's different. And my approach is to lay out a strategic plan for the district and then to build that contract and build a budget around the plan. Now, there is clearly a need for greater accountability in the police contract. I'm not here to say all 14 points or 13 points or 12 points or those recommendations that have been articulated by individual groups are the ones that we would want to embrace. But certainly having a process by which we can expedite the removal of officers who have clearly violated the code of conduct. And I'm talking about just not only in their treatment of individuals, but also in their honesty and transparency, et cetera. I mean, there are standards that we need to adhere to and reach a consensus on, and that will form the basis of negotiation. But my approach is going to be the approach that I've taken with the 26 collective bargaining agreements that I've negotiated, which I've always completed on time and without rancor, and that's to sit down with not only the police department, but also those who have been advocating for changes in the contract and those who have been advocating and have played a role in the creation of the consent decree, and to get input from all parties as we develop a collective strategy to negotiate the next police contract.
Ms. Enyia.
district, and the role of the mayor is absolutely critical to make sure that they are advocating fiercely for the best interests of the taxpayers and residents of the city. They must carry that role in these contract negotiations. There were a number of groups that worked tirelessly for quite some time and outlined specific points that needed to be pushed in the police contract, at least in those negotiations, specifically around transparency. Having data on police and their records beyond 5 years, which was a criteria that was problematic, because we need to know what the record is for officers so that we know who's policing our communities and whether they've been reprimanded or disciplined. So that was one touch point. Another touch point is records from officers coming from different police districts. Where are they coming from? Did they have problematic experiences or records in their previous place of employment? And if so, how does that factor into where they are placed within the department, how they are disciplined? Those are details that speak specifically to the issues that community members have been bringing up for years around police accountability. And we have to have a mayor who is willing to take those issues seriously and advocate fiercely, because when we don't, we pay not just a moral cost in terms of a department that loses legitimacy, we also pay a financial cost, which costs us billions of dollars at this point because of misconduct. So any mayor who's walking into this position has to come at a baseline ready to fiercely advocate for what's in the best interest of the entire city of Chicago.
Mr. Ford.
As mayor of the city of Chicago, it's critical that we take a look at the DOJ's report, the consent decree that's being negotiated in Springfield. Those have to be on the table when you negotiate with the police FOP. So that's going to be a guiding principle to make sure that that's on the table and that we can negotiate. Now, it has to be community, FOP, and it has to be the mayor's office. And so that's how I would lead the discussion. I'm not going to say that I'm going to open up the negotiations with the FOP with preconceived notions only that we should be looking at the DOJ's report. So that's going to be the guiding principles for starting the discussion with the FOP.
Mr. Kozler.
Yeah, so the specific changes, so right now in order to police in Chicago, you just have to live in the city, and I know I mentioned this twice, but again, I want to reiterate it because I think this is a direct solution that will benefit all of Chicago, is my 60-40 plan. 60% of police officers have to live there, and what you're building community relationships, because if the community and the police department don't work together, I don't care if you add 1,000 more detectives, if there's no cooperation, then the problems are going to persist. The other thing is training. I think the police officers and the FOP will agree that we just need to provide more training for our police officers because the times are changing. We're no longer in the 20th century. We're in the 21st century, so we have to incorporate 21st century ideas. The other part is overtime pay. And it's not just the police department, it's just from the city in general, is that we have over $481 million in bonuses and overtime pay that we can no longer sustain. I know this might be the last question, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to talk about our city finances, which is a big issue in Chicago, especially for my generation. We keep talking about this kicking the can down the road. Well, my generation is that wall we keep pounding, and there's no more road left. So we have to resolve those issues. Thank you. And the other, again, and the biggest part for me is just community engagement. We have to engage our communities, listen to our communities. We have to have more CAPS meetings. We have to have town hall meetings so we can listen to each neighborhood's needs, because although it's a big city, each neighborhood has different needs that they need.
Ms. Lightfoot.
So the question was about
Any changes, if you were to be mayor, to be made in the contract the city is negotiating with the Fraternal Order of Police?
Well, the truth is that Rahm Emanuel is going to leave this as unfinished business, along with the supervisor's contracts as well. And if you want to know specifically what I think about the changes that need to be made, please do take a look at the Police Accountability Task Force report. We laid out in detail what needs to change to get the police contracts to be consistent with the Constitution and consistent with our values. But let me talk about a few of those issues now. They can't destroy records. We should be able to use the entire disciplinary history. They shouldn't be allowed to force the most inexperienced officers into the toughest districts on the midnight shift and ask them to be the police. We should be able to take anonymous complaints against the police. I have to put my glasses on to read my notes. Definitely
vote
that
for
age.
John Kozler.
And we shouldn't be able to allow serious cases to go to arbitration into a black box where the public has no insights or view. Obviously, we also need to look at, frankly, every reform effort that the FLP has fought, from body cams to tasers to new use of force order. All of those things and more are part of the issues that we have to put on the table. Amara is right. I'll agree with her on this. We do need a mayor who will take these issues seriously, and there's been nobody in this race who's been more of a fierce advocate for police reform and accountability than I have.
And now we will allow for 1 minute each. And oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
I'm all sorts of looking ahead.
That's all right.
You are most definitely going to be last but not least for this final question. Ms. Preckwinkle.
I think there are three things that we need to focus on. There's presently a requirement that you provide an affidavit when you complain about the misconduct of a police officer. So there's not an opportunity for anonymous complaints, and that leaves people fearful of retribution. We give officers 24 hours to get their story straight when there's a police shooting. 24 hours. I presume that's to give them time to talk to whoever else was on the street with them to be sure that their stories are all, corroborated. That's ridiculous. And it contributes to the notion that, police officers should cover for each other and they should all have the same story. We definitely have to allow past disciplinary records to be used in investigating or considering the current complaint. Clearly, if you're a police officer that has a record of a number of civilian complaints, you're in a different position than the officer who this is the first time they've ever been cited for anything. So we have to allow anonymous complaints. We shouldn't make people provide affidavits. We have to reduce the time that officers have to get their stories straight, and we need to be sure that past disciplinary records are considered when you look at the present complaint. That's it. I think that's kind of right.
I didn't see the red there, but then again, I almost skipped you. So again, apologies there. For real this time, closing statements. We'll begin with you, Ms. Enyia.
So again, I think that we as a city are at a critical moment where we realize that the past and the status quo has simply not worked. It's led us to where we are. And what's necessary is a new way of thinking and being so that we can have the city that we deserve. When we talk about our platform, and it's a very people-centered platform, we basically talk about two primary things: justice and innovation. Justice entails all of the inequities that we see in education, in housing, in the economy, in policing, in the criminal justice system. We've talked about many of those issues. And until the city of Chicago rights those historic wrongs, which were intentional matters of public policy, we cannot be as great as we claim to be. Innovation. We are a city that is mired in the status quo, the Chicago way, the way things have always been. And it stifles our potential. New ideas that exist elsewhere, that are being tried and tested, solutions to the problems that we face, but we have to be willing to move forward. Innovation requires that the best and brightest ideas that we have must be set forth, and our leadership should represent that. We must walk away from the baggage of corruption, the baggage of limited thinking, and a commitment to mediocrity because we've been afraid of moving the city in the right direction. My campaign represents that, and we are looking forward to sharing that vision with the city.
LaShawn Ford. Yes, LaShawn Ford.
One of the first resolutions that I passed in Springfield was a resolution for social justice, to say that our principles and our guiding principles when we do business in the House of Representatives and in Springfield should be guided by social justice. As a Catholic growing up on the west side of Chicago in Austin, I couldn't think of a better partner than the ACLU and all of you in the room as the mayor of the city of Chicago. The mayor has a extremely important responsibility as it relates to a budget. That budget should be moral, and that budget should make sure that it takes care of the people in the city of Chicago. And we haven't had that in the city of Chicago in this last administration. Under a Ford administration, our office will have partners just like the ACLU, just like the NAACP, to make sure that we bring justice, to make sure that we eradicate discrimination and racism in our CPS, in our CPD, in our CHA. These are the things that we have to do if we want our city to be great. The only way to make the city great is to make sure that we eliminate racism in our city, and we do it together. So let's join together as we continue to work to do that so that we can have the best city in the nation, and I will continue to work with you as I have in Springfield as your mayor.
John Kozler.
First of all, I just want to thank everybody again for coming out. It's been a wonderful night, and especially to the moderator, thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody from the audience, for your time, and thank you for everybody organizing this here today. A few things I just want to touch on is I enjoy crowds like these because obviously we've disagreed on a couple issues, but we respect each other. We just haven't been experiencing that from our politicians. I personally don't think our politicians respect the citizens of Chicago. Amen. But then again, we are the ones that empower them. We are the ones that vote them in. And I don't know who you're going to vote for. It's none of my business. But all I ask that you please do vote in 2019. This is one of the, if not the most important election for Chicago moving forward because we have a lot of politicians in this election who are simply tied to the past.
Don't point this way.
Not him. Not are simply tied to the past. And politically, in some stances, we just need to start over. We need a tidal wave of change, and I will offer that as your next mayor. Thank you.
Lori Lightfoot.
Fundamentally, the choice that we face is, are we resigned to this broken status quo that has failed so many across the city, or are we going to vote our values and recognize that we have power to transform our city and lead us all together in a completely different direction? That, to me, is what this election is going to be about. I got into this election when Rahm Emanuel was still on the ballot because I saw that even though we have a lot of great things in our city, that too many of our people in our neighborhoods were being left behind. And I know that we can do better than having 25% unemployment that permeates so many of our neighborhoods, so many of our children living in poverty, lack of hope and opportunity in neighborhood after neighborhood, particularly on the south and the west side, and having the illegal drug trade be the primary employer in so many of our neighborhoods. We have to speak our values in this election. John's right about one thing, which is this election is probably one of the most important in our lifetime. We haven't had a competitive election since 1986 when Harold was elected for a second term. We must stand up with people of goodwill all across the city, ACLU leading the charge and others, and say that we must go in a different direction. And if you want an independent leader who will put reform first, who will make sure that we speak our values and that the lived experience of people all over the city becomes our North Star.
With that,
I'm your candidate. Thank you.
Toni Preckwinkle.
I want to end by thanking the ACLU. This is an organization that has been committed throughout its history to social justice, marriage equality, criminal justice reform, police accountability, and of course, in this very, very difficult time, advocacy for our immigrant population. And I'm very grateful to the ACLU for its good work. It's social justice that's motivated me throughout my public life. It's what led to my commitment to try to make our healthcare system stronger, more sustainable, and provide a better quality of care to hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands. It's what led me to focus on cash bond bail reform so that we have 4,000 fewer people in the jail today than we did when I came into office. 4,000 fewer people on a daily basis. It's what led me in the city council to be a founder of the Progressive Caucus, to work for affordable housing and living wage ordinances and be the sponsor of those ordinances throughout my career in the city council. It's what led me as an alderman in the city of Chicago to focus on strengthening our neighborhood schools, bringing jobs to our neighborhoods, and addressing public safety issues. Those are all social justice concerns, and I've proved in my public life my commitment and dedication to social justice, as all of you have as members of ACLU. I thank you for your good work and hope for your support. Thank you.
And Paul Vallas.
We're sitting in crisis. We have $28 billion debt, and if the estimates on pensions are understated, it's $52 billion in debt. We've had development in only 10 of our 50 wards. Some west sides and south sides are economic deserts. Generational poverty. We have the highest murder rate compared to New York and LA combined. We've lost 17% of our real residential property value. We have lead in our water and decaying infrastructure, and we're probably about to get smacked with another massive tax increase after a record tax increase. We are Detroit with a thriving downtown, and that's our future at the end of the day. I'm running because my entire life has been taking on institutions that have been severe financial distress or at the verge of financial collapse, and not only stabilizing them and helping them grow, but by building long-term financial plans that would invest in the communities and address the needs in those communities so that those communities could grow. This election has got to be about solutions. It's got to be about substantive solutions and not rhetoric. And that's why it's so important. Thank you.
Thank you so much to each of the candidates and to the ACLU for hosting this forum. And again, to each of you, I would like to remind you that, as was noted, these questions were all within the scope of civil liberties per an agreement that the ACLU made with each of the campaigns. We did not see everybody who turned in a questionnaire that these questions were based off of, but those who did, you can find them online. You don't even have to write down a long web address. On your program, you have a QR code, so you can be fancy and high-tech, and just go to the questionnaires there. ACLU has also asked me to remind you that they are hosting a luncheon March 15th, so check out the website for that. I'm Amanda Vinicky with Chicago Tonight. WTTW will be hosting its own series of mayoral forums on the 14th, 18th, and 19th of February, so tune into that. Thank you so much for your time, and travel safe.